Hi everyone, welcome to PriorityZero, a LeadDev engineering leadership podcast. I'm your host, Scott Carey. This is the podcast where we talk about your biggest priorities in tech and also how you got to where you are today. I am joined by Vella. Annie, thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure, thank you. It's great to be here. Well, I live in Auckland, New Zealand, so I've come an awfully long way, literally on the other side of the world, to be here at Staff Plus, and it's been really great so far. So I'm a distinguished engineer at Westpac New Zealand. I've been at Westpac for just over 3.5 years, but only just under a year in the current role that I'm in. And it's been quite a journey of discovery and trying to figure out what type of role it really is, what is it that I should be focusing on, and I think everybody goes through phases like that in their career, so I'm just riding it through.
Yeah, I really want to talk about that. I think Distinguished Engineer is such an interesting title, and I think with this being the PriorityZero podcast, I think working out what that PriorityZero is a big part of your role. But I don't want to jump ahead. I want to hear a little bit more about that journey. So when did you first become interested in software engineering or software?
Very, very early on. I think I'm probably one of the lucky few who knew very early in their life what they were interested in. So I was an only child until I was about 7 years old, and my brother came along.
Ruined everything.
That's right, I had all the attention. But my parents were both pretty busy, so they tried to keep me busy with puzzles. I loved puzzles. And they ended up buying me a Commodore 64. So that was pretty cool back for its, in its time.
Still cool now, I'd say.
Yeah, and in fact, I still have it.
Nice.
I still have
Does it still work?
I don't know.
No.
I'm too scared to plug it in case it might just go boom. And I don't have quite the right cables for it. So it's gone up as a piece of art on my wall. And yeah, it came with a basic manual. So rather than playing the games, I actually flicked through this manual and decided, well, what would happen if I typed some of the stuff in? And before you knew it, I had a little smiley face bouncing around the screen. I made it play row, row, row your boat. I thought, wow, this is really incredible, like that you can just type some words in and then it makes it do something. And I think I recognized the power even at that young age. And part of me knew that from that point on, I was probably going to end up working with computers, programming somehow.
Yeah, you're hooked.
I really was. The games were less interesting than the basic was, as nerdy as that sounds.
Do you kind of miss BASIC in a weird way?
Yes and no. I think that the programming languages we have today are so much more powerful, but it gave you a taste for what was possible. And it was very frustrating in many ways because if you had a syntax error, then the whole thing just didn't work and you had to start from scratch because you couldn't save anything off. But from that point on, the schools that I went to generally didn't teach computing or computer science. I was lucky enough to do about 6 months of programming in one school. I moved around a lot because of my dad's job. And then I got back to New Zealand when I was about 16, ended up in an all-girls school, and they did not teach any form of computing. They did teach computing, but not computer programming. The computing that they taught was more about making titles bold in Word and things like that, which really wasn't the direction I was interested in. So I stuck with that while I had to, because it had the word computing in it, I was interested enough, and then went on to do maths and computer science at university.
In New Zealand?
Yes, in Wellington. My computer studies teacher from high school actually tried to dissuade me from going to university and doing computer science because she said, it was a she as well, she said I would be the worst in the class. All the boys would just run circles around me. And I thought, well, I'll show them then, If anything, that probably encouraged me to try a little harder.
Yeah.
And it was hard. Those first few semesters I thought, what am I doing here? I don't really understand anything. But I caught up, and the more I learnt, the more I understood, and the easier it became, actually. So, yeah, it was great. From that point on, I was absolutely hooked, and I was so grateful to have stuck with it,
She said the boys are going to run rings around you. Was it all boys?
Mostly. What was interesting is it started off sort of half-half. Mm-hmm. It was a big class, maybe 400 people. And then after just a few weeks, the girls started dropping out. And I've never really understood why they just didn't find it as interesting as I did. And then I became a tutor, and I saw it happening in my tutorials as well. And I did try asking a few, hey, well, you're not showing up as much anymore. And I don't really find it as interesting as some of my other papers, so I might just swap across to some other degree. It's like, oh no.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing it in the industry at large. We see that trend play out all the way through from school, all the way through to like into your career. Like the dropout rate of women in the industry from an already low base is so much higher than male. And there's a plethora of reasons that we will not get into on this podcast. But yeah, it's a through line that we see, and it's like finding ways to kind of mitigate that is proving really challenging. Absolutely. And slow that rate down.
Yeah.
So come out of university, computer science, what did you do next?
So yeah, I had an option to stay on and do a master's. I did an extra year, and that's called an honours in New Zealand, so yeah. And that was great, but after 4 years I needed a change. Like I did a lot of maths at uni, and it was very theoretical, and I was starting to wonder whether everything I'd learned was actually applicable in the real world or not. And I wanted to earn some money.
Yeah,
so
that helps.
Yeah. This was back in the early 2000s, and there just wasn't that much work for, it was that weird time when there weren't sites online where you could find jobs yet, but by the same token, people weren't really using newspapers either, so it was quite hard to find that first job, and it's just always hard to find the first job anyway. Yeah. You don't have experience.
And the dot-com bubble had just burst.
Yeah, yep, so it was a weird time.
Yeah.
So I ended up working as a GIS integration consultant, whatever that meant. But they gave me a shot, and I got to play with some code. It was a very small team, a small consultancy, and I did a lot of pre-sales work actually, which taught me quite a lot about needing to be confident in front of customers when the salespeople would say, yeah, of course we can do that. Like, yeah. Absolutely we can, right? And I'd be like, yes, yes we can, of course we can. And then you'd walk out going, that doesn't exist yet. Like, we can't make that happen. But I'd find ways because I'm curious and I persevere, so that was quite fun. But unfortunately, we never really sold as much as I'd like, so as much as I did a lot of sort of demos, I never followed through as much. Although we did have one project where one of the customers we had was the New Zealand Civil Aviation Authority, and they wanted to digitize and go like fully online, and they gave me the project to run, and I was 1 year out of uni, and like, wow. I don't think I can do this on my own. Like, if I mess this up, planes will literally crash, and I can't have that on my conscience. So thankfully they listened, and they got me some help from an external consultancy, and I learned a lot through that process. Yeah,
I often tell my team, don't worry, planes won't fall out of the sky if we get this wrong, but you literally had that situation.
Yes, that wouldn't have been much fun at all. But we didn't sell that either, so I had a lot of practice at putting together requirements docs and all that kind of stuff. And then at that point, I started looking for something else, a bit of a change, and I ended up working at a company called TradeMe in New Zealand. And they are basically like the eBay, but only of New Zealand.
Yeah.
And they were just the coolest, hippest company that existed in New Zealand at the time. So I was just so happy to have gotten that job. And at the time, they were really small. I mean, there were only about 70 people, and in total, and the development team was only about 5. And it was still when you had very much like you had your dev team, you had the test team, you had the ops team, and you had the DBAs.
You threw it over a wall.
But it worked really well, and I still think back to that today because, things have changed a lot since then, but we got through so much work. I was only there for about a year and a half, but in that time we launched 3 big sort of sections of the site, a job site, a property site, a new cars thing, which I led myself. We deployed to production twice a day, every day. This was before the days of DevOps and CI/CD.
That's crazy.
So we'd built a lot of our own tools, and we were migrating away from an older tech to a newer tech while we were making all these changes. So that was great experience. I finally felt like I was really building stuff, shipping it, and watching like most of New Zealand using the thing that I was building, and that was just super rewarding.
Nice. There's a case to be made for letting specialists do specialist things.
That's right, yes. And, with such a small team as well, you had less of that sort of communication overhead that you get with much larger teams.
I think it does work to a scale, and then it kind of maybe falls apart a little bit.
And it was a majestic monolith, so, it was just easy to reason about. All the code was in one place. It was easy to build and test and deploy. Yeah, I had a great time.
I'm sure there were moments that you have conveniently forgotten about,
Probably.
But it often does feel like those were the glory days. Yeah. And then you moved to Europe for a bit.
I did. So I had grand aspirations to work for Google at the time, and I'd gone through a couple of interview processes with them and failed miserably. Not
Notoriously
miserably,
quite tough.
Oh, so hard. And this was back in the day before we even had video conferencing software. So I literally did my interview over a telephone.
Oh, wow.
And they asked me questions like, oh, how would you find the longest common prefix for 1 million URLs in less than some amount of memory I can't remember anymore, and you've got the phone attached here. You're like, okay, let me just put some.
Can you answer that one, producer Charlie?
Yeah, it was hard. So I failed badly the first time, tried again, and they said, well.
Second time, were you like, I know the answer to that one. I'm going to get that question again.
Of course, they asked me all sorts of different questions the second time, and they said, look, you did quite well, but we don't think you're quite senior enough for the role that we've got, and we don't really have anyone that could help you get there either, so I'm sorry, it's a no again. And at that point I thought, you know what, I'm done trying this, because it was just so stressful every time. It was like doing an exam over and over again. So at that point I decided, okay, well, I still want to go overseas. I grew up moving 3 or 4 years. I would spend 3 or 4 years in any one country before we move again. So I'd spent 10 years in Wellington at this point, and I was like, it's time to go. So I decided to move to the UK, and then that didn't quite work out either. So I ended up in Australia, which is much easier for New Zealanders to move to. So yeah, I went to Brisbane, spent a year in between a couple of little jobs. First I ended up in a job with a construction agency, and it was not at all what I thought it was going to be. Part of the dev team, and I get there, I'm like, I am the dev team. And actually I'm the support team. And when people have issues with their Access database, I fix that by clicking the repair button and sending it back to them. I was like, this is not at all what I had in mind. I'm so sorry. They were lovely people, but I had to move on. And then I ended up in a little consultancy, and at least then I got to do a bit more coding of the sort of stuff that I enjoyed doing. And then after that I was like, okay, I've done my time here. Now I really need to get to the UK, or at least Europe somewhere. I just had these visions of, flatting in London and doing that OE that most Kiwis want to do at some point or other. So yeah, I ended up in London without a job. I just came. I got a working holiday visa, 2 years. So you can just arrive and look for work. You don't have to be sponsored by anyone. So it was very exciting. I came with my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband, and he's here with me today as well. We're both software engineers, so we've shared a lot of our careers together. And I ended up contracting for a music streaming site. It was not Spotify. Unfortunately, they were a competitor, and clearly they won. No one ever heard of the one that we were building. But it was a really cool environment. We were in this sort of loft, and the money was good. I mean, compared to the New Zealand dollar, the pound was very strong and on contract rates. So I did a lot of travel. I learned a lot in that job. I feel like as great as it was working for TradeMe and as much as I got done there, I'd never heard of unit tests before. This was sort of mid to late 2000s. Get to London, and that's, everyone's doing that kind of stuff, and they're sharding their databases and they're co-locating this and that. I'm like, wow, I really need to catch up on this. A dependency injection, what's that? Oh no, I feel so behind. But you're presented with challenges like that, and you can either run away from them or see them as an opportunity to learn. So. But
that's what you wanted, right, by the sounds of it?
Absolutely.
So why was Google here for you? What was it about that company?
I guess I just saw them as the epitome of good software engineering. They represented the do no evil and all of that. I mean, I guess things have changed now, but at least at the time they were really cutting edge. They were doing the big scale stuff. To be honest, they did end up offering me the job after all of that, but by then I had a bit of a sour taste in my mouth after being rejected twice, and the job they offered me stupidly. On my part, it was a role as a software engineer in the test team. And by this stage, I'd been a software engineer in the software development team. Yes. And I was like, I don't know that I want to spend my life breaking other people's stuff. I want to be shipping the features myself. So I turned it down. And they were quite offended. But And I looked back over the years, did I make a mistake? Should I have taken the job anyway? Especially since nowadays, we don't really have test teams as such anymore. It's all blurred, and it is just, you're writing code anyway, whether you're writing the feature or you're writing code to test someone else's work. I just didn't see it like that at the time. So anyway, the rest is history. I've never worked for Google, probably never will at this point, but it doesn't matter.
There's no point in harping on it.
So yeah, I spent almost a year at that little music streaming site and learned a lot there, and then decided it was time for a change. Was still in London, ended up through another agency working for a hotel booking site, Yotel or something. So by this stage, I've already worked at sort of 5 different industries or domains, and I started realizing that that's one of the benefits of being a software engineer is you learn about all these different industries just by virtue of working for them, building their software. You have to understand something about that industry or domain in order to be able to build software that makes sense for them.
Yeah.
So I spent a few months there. It wasn't very long because then my visa was running out and I had a big decision to make. Do I try and find a way to stay here? I would have loved to, but it's quite hard if you don't, if you're not married to a UK citizen, which I wasn't. My husband now is a UK citizen, but we hadn't been together for long enough. It was too complicated. And we had an opportunity to go and work in the Netherlands. I had a friend there, so we'd gone to visit, and he said, well, why don't you send me your CV? I mean, we're always looking for developers. Like, that could work. So did that and went for an interview, and they hired both me and my husband. So, all right, I guess we're moving to the Netherlands. So we jumped on our motorbike and rode down to Amsterdam. And suddenly
It's nice that you can do that.
Yes, especially when you've come from the other side of the world where to get anywhere is this massive journey, many flights. And so spent 10 years in Amsterdam all up.
How long did you work at the same company together?
We were there for about 3 years, and then it was there that I actually moved into management, so I'm sure we'll come back to that.
We will get to that.
And then, my husband was working with me there, and then we both moved to the next company together, and we both moved to the next company together. What happens is every time you go and interview somewhere, they go, you wouldn't happen to know any other good software engineers, which actually I do. So
clearly it's not a problem.
No, not at all. We actually feel like we're kind of greater than the sum of 2 parts because we see things from slightly different perspectives, and we do tend to talk a lot about work outside of work as well. And we enjoy it. It's both of our passions, so we bounce ideas off each other, and we still work together now. So
nice.
We've had periods where we haven't, but we're back to working together.
It works. Now. If it works, it works.
Absolutely.
So then, eventually the management track came knocking.
That's right. So I was at this company. And it was quite interesting because I got there and there just wasn't that much work to do. I was quite confused by that because the previous jobs I'd had, it was just go, go, go. And suddenly I'm sort of bored at work. It's 10 a.m. and I'm like, there's just not that much to do. And
it's not a good feeling.
No, not at all. I'm like, is it home time yet? And you don't want to sit there surfing Facebook. That doesn't feel right. But my manager wasn't around much. When he was, we would be like, hey, is there anything we could be working on? And he'd say, oh, I'm not really sure. I'll talk to you later. And then he'd disappear again. You're like, what's happening? It turns out that they were looking at selling the company. And so he was very busy and didn't really want us to get started on anything in particular, but couldn't tell us about this. And so at that point, I started creating work for myself. Well, I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. So at the time, the online shop, it was a photo printing or photo book printing company that then spread out into printing other products with photos in it as well. But they had an online shop, and it was all built using the old ASPX type technology from the .NET, the older .NET stuff. And I had been working with ASP.NET at the time, and I thought, what if I could port it across to ASP.NET?
We'll just do a small migration.
I'll just see if I can do this by myself. Why not? I mean, there's no one else to tell me not to, and there's nothing else to do anyway. So that's what I embarked on. And honestly, within about a month, I had done maybe 80% of it. 80-20 rule, yes, the last 20% took a little longer. But I remember a lot of my colleagues looking at me going, it's never going to work. You're not going to be able to pull that off. I was like, watch me. There may be a theme here. Where I'm like, watch me. So Yeah, and that was a really satisfying piece of work. I pulled that off, we deployed it to production, and suddenly it opened up a lot more doors in terms of being able to unit test things properly and really separate concerns, because that was when you started pulling the code behind, which is more of the business logic away from the front end. And so that was quite enjoyable. And then I just seemed to become the person who looked for work, you know, and when I'd see other colleagues sort of sitting there, but they looked a bit bored, or maybe I noticed that they weren't that busy, I'd be like, there's this weird bug that seems to happen every night at around 3 a.m. You see it in the logs. So do you think you could take a look at that? And I guess in a way I suddenly naturally became the team lead without taking the position or being offered the position. And it was not long after that my manager went, it's pretty clear that you're actually running the team now. I need to move on to another role. Do you think you'd like to take that on? And I thought long and hard about it, because I had always thought, I don't want to manage people. I'm a mathematician, I'm a computer scientist, I love computers, I want to work with computers. And yes, I interact with people all day, every day, but there's a difference between interacting with people and managing them. And I would become the manager of my colleagues who I'd been working with for a couple of years by this point. Yeah. So it took me a long time to decide to say yes, and I did only because I'd really reached a ceiling at that point. I think I was a lead senior dev or something, and where do you go
kept putting extra words in front of
it. Where do you go to? Maybe architecture, but then there was like one architect at the company, and I wasn't really sure that was the direction I wanted to go in anyway. So I took on the team lead role. I figured if anything, it would teach me something. I wasn't sure what yet, but it would teach me something, so I might as well try it and grow into that. And it was hard. It was hard to learn how to do performance reviews of people that were your friends and colleagues.
Managing peers is so challenging.
Yes, giving feedback is hard, and yeah, that was, I was only in that role for about 6 months until another recruiter reached out and offered me a different role. It was very similar at a different company, but the title was a delivery manager, so I thought, oh, well, that'll give me something else to learn, or maybe there's a slightly different tint on it. So I moved on to that role, and this next one was at an online travel agency. So suddenly I was learning all about how flights work, how one books flights, the difference between legs and segments and all of that kind of stuff.
Global distribution systems.
That's right.
Very fun.
Yes, you know about those. Yes, we used Amadeus at the time, and they were looking at Sabre, and I was like, wow, there's so much to learn. So I'd gone from learning about how to print images on mugs to figuring out how you book these sorts of international
different domains.
Once again, moved on to something new. I've never worked in the same domain twice.
It's amazing. And we recorded a podcast this morning with Katerina from Meta, and we were talking about how much she values working in a single domain. And she studied journalism and computer science, and then went to work for the New York Times, and then now does content recommendations systems at Meta. So it's kind of quite linear and with lots of depth. And you're the opposite end of the spectrum. You really value, by the sounds of it, that kind of feeling of learning about a new domain and kind of moving on to the next one and the next one.
I often wonder whether it has something to do with the way I was brought up. My dad was a diplomat with the New Zealand embassy, and that's why we moved so much, you see. So every 3 or 4 years I was in a new country with a new language and a new school, a new set of friends, and this was before the days of the internet. So when you said goodbye, it really felt like I might never see you again. Maybe write me a letter. So I was quite used to change, and I think I've kind of kept that up in my own life. I've moved around a bit, and I've also moved around between jobs and these different domains. But I can also see the value in staying in one domain, or at least sort of piggybacking one off the other, because it would give you a depth that I probably will never achieve. And aside from the computer science part, that's the constant for me.
Yeah.
So then I was working at this company, and I spent probably just over a year there. I didn't last very long in these companies, not because there was any good reason to leave, but something better always seemed to appear, and then it was a toss-up but I am enjoying this job and I'm learning a lot. And in that job, they put me through some management courses, and so I started off managing one team, and then I was managing 2 teams, and the second team was a data team. So actually they were the business intelligence, the BI team. And we went through a bit of a rebranding, and this was all my doing. I thought, actually, this is not really working for us because they needed some coding skills in that. It wasn't just SQL,
Yes.
They were meant to be producing reports, but they first needed to get the data in there in the right format, and that needed to come from a variety of different places. So I actually needed some more software development skills in there. So I kind of rebranded the team to a data team, and managed to convince a couple of my software engineers from my other team to jump across and maybe help out in this domain. And something that I still think about every now and then is a good friend of mine who I'm going to see next week in Amsterdam. He had come in as a software engineer, and he decided that he would try it out over in that data team. And to this day, he now still works more with data, and it's become his thing, So I feel like I might have had a little part in helping him discover that was something he really loved.
And did it surprise you how much kind of gratification you got from that?
And that's the kind of stuff that you learn from being in that sort of manager type of role that you might not, especially as a, if you get to sort of senior software engineer, you're probably not going to get the opportunities to have that kind of impact on other people. So I did value that a lot.
And for someone who clearly valued solving problems and getting stuff done, that must have been quite eye-opening.
Yes, and in many ways you start to realize that it's just those problems to be solved anyway. And I didn't need to necessarily be writing code to do that. And that took some adjusting though, and that was very rewarding. And then, this other opportunity came along to go contracting again for much more money, to be honest.
Yep.
It was very attractive. And also to help build something from scratch. So it was working with a colleague who I had previously worked with here in London. He was still here, and he'd managed to get himself a really nice deal building out what did we call it? A custodian as a service for an American company. So they were a pension custodian for Roth IRAs and traditional IRAs. New domain.
Yes.
Very complex domain.
Yes.
Pensions. I barely had one of my own because when you move around as much as I do, you don't have that sort of stability of like, I'm just going to contribute to this for the rest of my life. Doesn't make sense. We were working remotely. So my husband also joined this team as well. So
Of course.
we were working together from home. Our kitchen table was our office. And we really were there from right at the start. So I remember when the solution didn't even build and when we had to get something up and running. And it was a tiny team of about 5 of us, just all contractors working from various parts of the world. And that's where I think I've spent the longest. I spent almost 4 years working on that. And it was so satisfying because we went from nothing to having this platform that had over 1 million accounts on it. We were trying to get the company who had commissioned this piece of work. They were a brick and mortar sort of business. They had a little office based in San Jose in California. And the CEO, bless him, he's passed away now, but he was 94 years old. Still running his company, still showing up every day,
Wow.
running meetings. Sometimes he'd fall asleep in the meetings, and that was really cute.
Well, I'll give him a pass.
Exactly, right? You cannot blame him. And he was just so passionate about his business and the business that he was in. But he recognized that a lot of the systems that they had they were crumbling. They were old, sort of green screen, a lot of data entry, paper forms, a lot of batch processing overnight and then keying things in the morning. And so he had found somebody who had a vision to create more of an API-based system that then other companies could integrate with directly. So it was more of a cloud platform type of thing, all on Azure. And I wrote a lot of code. I started off just as a software developer in that team, so I really went back from that management role to now I'm just coding all day, every day. And that transition was a little hard, to be honest.
I'm sure.
I hadn't coded for a good couple of years. I was still playing with things at home a little bit, and with that data team at the previous company, I'd done up some visualizations because we had data. I was like, I can do stuff with this data. I can render like a plane flying across the globe every time that we got a new booking. I was like, look at where it goes. That was fun, but I hadn't really built anything significant for a while, so I was a bit rusty.
Yeah.
I had a lot of sort of imposter syndrome moments of what have I done? Maybe I've lost all my skills, but it comes back. It's like learning a language or riding a bike, right? You never really forget.
Yeah.
I suppose if enough time passes and the technology changes enough, you might struggle even more. But
I think it just gets harder. It doesn't become impossible.
Right.
Yeah.
And it all depends on how much you really want to get back into it. If you want to, you'll find a way. So, and I really did. So I enjoyed that very much. But naturally, again, I ended up kind of running the team. Like it wasn't long before I was like, oh, we need to know what we're working on next. So what I did, and I think it really helped a lot, was I ended up reading through this IRA manual, the Individual Retirement Account. The IRS prints this manual. It was the driest thing in the world, but someone had to read it because we had to understand how all the rules worked around contributions and the distributions and how you report on these to the IRS, who have no sense of humor at all. So you can't get that wrong. And you're dealing with people's money, so you really can't get any of this wrong. But we automated so much of it, and what was really challenging there was showing the company how they could work differently, because they'd been doing the same job for 40 years. They'd show up every day and they knew that this report will have been printed and that they would key the stuff in, and then they'd get these papers from here and move them there. And suddenly we're going, well, you don't need to do that anymore because the customer just registers themselves. Yeah. And then their account's already open. And they're like, but we pre-generate account numbers. You don't need to do that anymore. We just assign it on the way in.
Yeah.
But so there was a lot of learning there in terms of how do you take them on that journey with you. Yeah. Well, that was very satisfying, and got it to a point where the company that the 94-year-old was running, he wanted to sell it before he moved on, and I managed to help pull that through. Nice. So one of the last things I did was travel to San Francisco and set up in this meeting with the board of the buying company and the very high up in the Salesforce Tower in San Francisco. Yeah. Massive building, very intimidating, but I knew so much about the platform that we'd built because I'd been there from the start that I could just talk endlessly about it. Great. And hopefully that all helped because they made a great deal and sold the company off, and I thought at that point it's time to move on. That's awesome. And then I moved on to a company called MessageBird, who is now called Bird. They've rebranded and they're based in Amsterdam. And that was back into an engineering manager role. And that was very chaotic, to be honest. It was very fast-paced. Their motto was "get shit done," and hey, it works really well for them. I learned a lot about incident management because actually, as an engineering manager, you went immediately just on the roster as an incident manager. Okay. So whenever you were on call, if there was an incident, you got paged, and you had to make sure that all the right people were there to sort it all out and run blameless postmortems. And I learned a lot about SRE there and got to use Google Cloud platforms. So lots to learn there as well. But it was only about a month and a half into that role that COVID hit. And the world changed. And suddenly the fantastic offices that they had with the great lunches, it was all gone. And they struggled with the idea of working remotely because they'd always brought people together.
It's a big culture change.
Whereas I'd been working remotely for 4 years, so I think I helped them sort of, hey, we can do this. I've done it for a while. You just have to go do everything that you're doing today, but online. You just use the tools that exist. There's good enough tools, and they got better and better. So I spent just over a year at MessageBird because during COVID, I started realizing just how far away from New Zealand I really was. My whole family's there. I don't have a very big family, it's just mum and dad and my brother, but they're all in New Zealand. And as much as we'd made it work by traveling back and forth for the 13 years I'd been away, that wasn't a thing anymore when New Zealand shut its borders. It's like, how long might this last? What if something were to happen to mum and dad? I might not even be back to help, or a funeral or something. That's awful. So made the big decision to pack things up and move back home, which was really hard to do during a pandemic, believe it or not.
Especially with New Zealand.
Yes. So they had the isolation, the MIQ they called it, so 2 weeks worth of isolation, and you had to book a slot in, and then you were so fearful that you might catch COVID and then not be able to catch a flight and everything falls apart. But thankfully the trip back home went seamlessly. although traveling through Singapore during a pandemic, it was very surreal. There were people wearing head to toe, hazmat suits, and you couldn't go anywhere near anyone. Don't touch anything. Don't give your passport to anyone. It was a very strange time. But got back to New Zealand without a job again. Just got back and I'll find a job. And so had a few different interviews, a few different opportunities, and one of them was for Westpac. I'd never worked at such a large company before. I'd never worked for a bank before. The retirement accounts were kind of the closest I'd gotten. So I thought I'll give that a go because I haven't tried it before. So, let's add a new one to the list. And I joined Westpac as a tech area lead.
Okay. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it kind of translates to a senior engineering manager because basically I had chapter leads reporting to me and they had the engineers reporting to them. But I went from like 2 to 3 teams to 13 teams. And that's not immediately. We had to scale up because we had a big piece of regulatory work that we had to do. And it was very different. It is very different.
How did you learn to navigate that? Like with 3 people, you can stay in touch. With 13, it starts to get really difficult. I think that's a really hard thing for a lot of managers to navigate, is that kind of step change.
You have to form really, really good, open, trusting relationships with as many people as you can, really, but particularly those that are reporting to you, because you need to hear what's going on, beyond that first layer. And I guess because I'm just very curious, when I have a free moment, I look at what the builds are doing, and I look at what kind of code we're writing, and I try to connect the dots, and I have some really, really great team members and colleagues that would tell me when things weren't going as well as they felt they should be. It was a big transition, and I think it was more than the size and that sort of depth. It was also, it's just such a big company,
How big is Westpac for people who aren't familiar?
Westpac New Zealand has about 6,000 employees. Biggest company I'd ever worked for was maybe 400.
Yeah.
So I was used to knowing most people. You're walking around an office and you're like, hey, how's it going? Not at Westpac. You're walking past going, I've never seen you before. Do you actually work
What do you
here?
do?
I hope you haven't just snuck in. But the technology teams at Westpac are about 1,000, which is still way more than you'll ever know personally, right? So I was working in a tribe called business segments, and that means that we were looking after business customers. And we're building up a new business online portal, trying to replace one that's been there for a long time and is a bit out of date by now.
Business banking user experiences have kind of trailed behind the rest for a long time.
That's right, and they are quite different to your retail users, And then there was a bit of a restructure at work, and we merged 2 different departments together, and so my role was changing significantly. And I had the option of taking a redundancy or find another role. And my manager at the time, who's now my peer, absolutely wonderful manager, and he helped find the role that I'm in now for me. He spoke to a number of people who then came and spoke to me and said, we actually need someone who really cares about the technology, who has had experience building systems like these. I'm not a Java developer, but we use Java at Westpac. But the structures are all the same. The syntax is quite similar to the C# that I always wrote, but we're solving problems. And like I said before, they're all problems to solve, So, and I took the opportunity because I had been looking. I had read the books that I mentioned in my talk just earlier today by Will Larson and Tanya Riley, these great books about staff engineering.
Yeah,
and I thought, that's what I want to do. That's my next step for sure. And
it's quite an interesting path, because I feel like we typically see people kind of hit a point earlier in their career where they either go down the management track or go down the IC track, which kind of maybe will branch into the staff track, and then they work their way up that. Whereas you've kind of gone aside, up and across.
Yes.
And so I think that, I'll be really interested to hear like how that was for you, going from kind of managing explicitly to implicitly.
Yes. You know, I think even when you're managing explicitly, gone are the days of like ruling with an iron
Command and
fist,
control,
right?
yeah.
So it's really, even then, it was all about influence and saying the right things to the right people and hoping that they come on that journey with you. I thoroughly believe in curiosity. I'm not sure that if you don't have that curious bone in your body, it must be quite hard to just stick with it, you know,
Yeah.
because a lot of the problems we solve are, you have to keep going and you have to persevere.
I think it's a great trait. Is it one you look for when you're hiring people?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. I can sense it, you know,
Yeah.
and it doesn't mean that you have to have like pet projects at home that it's more about asking questions but why does that work or why does it not work and could it work better and what other options do we have and, you know,
Yeah.
asking questions. I became known as the annoying question asker because I like asking questions. I want to understand, why did we choose to do it that way? I'm sure there were good reasons and I want to know about them.
You could have been a good journalist once upon a time.
Potentially. And now that I'm getting better at this whole public speaking thing, maybe.
There's far less money in it. I wouldn't do it.
No, computers were definitely in my future.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've transitioned into this role. I've been in it for just under a year now. And I think for me, the best part has been just the sheer context that I have access to now. So I get to speak with our CIO fairly frequently.
So this is your role as a distinguished engineer?
That's right, yes. Our CIO joined about 2 years ago, I think. And
Where from?
He'd been a CIO at 2 other banks in New Zealand, so he's very well seasoned. He'd actually retired, and then he'd come back out of retirement to come to Westpac. And I admire him massively. He's a really intelligent, deep thinker. For someone who's so high up in the organization, he knows just the right questions to ask at just the right time. You know, I'll be sitting in a room with various colleagues, you know, people who I see as my colleagues, even though I'm not in the same tech area lead role anymore, they mostly are, but I still get to hang out with all of them. And our CIO will ask a question and the rest of us will be like, yeah, that's a really good question. Oh, why didn't anyone else think of that? You know, like
It's a skill.
It really is. And so I wanted to learn from him. So he's become my mentor. Mm-hmm. And I get to speak with him on a monthly basis. And he gives me good context about the really big picture, you know. And now I reflect back on my years. You know, I've been working now for 20 years and all those different phases you go through where as an individual contributor that's still kind of early on in their career, you know, just getting the code to run is a big struggle and you don't want that extra context because it's just overwhelming actually. Yeah. You don't need it, you don't want it. And then as you grow, you experience more years go by and then that context becomes very important. And it changes the way you see things and the decisions you make. You start optimizing for the bigger picture if you know it, but you have to have access to it. And I have access to oodles of it.
And as someone who went from the manager track back to the IC track, I often find that that's really appealing, but I actually think that losing that context can become really hard.
Yeah.
Because you become accustomed to it.
Yes, yeah, and it changes the way, what you prioritize, you know, and you can really start to see when teams are optimizing for the local maxima in their area, you know, and trying to share enough context with them without overwhelming them as to why that decision, yes, I can see how it would be really great for your project in this particular point in time, but we need to think about in 2 years' time or in 5 years' time when you might have moved on to another role, you know, will there be anyone else who knows how to work on this beautiful solution that you put together in a language that no one else knows how to work with?
Yeah.
So I have a lot of those sorts of conversations these days. There's a lot of work to be done at the bank. You know, it's 162 years old, the company. Yeah. So there's a lot of debt that's been incurred in that sense, not just technical, but process and organizational. So just heaps of challenges, but likewise lots and lots of opportunities to make a massive difference.
And you talked about a manager earlier that you really admired. You talked about your CTO who you really admire. What is it in a good manager or a good peer that you really admire so far?
I think they really care about leaving the organization in a better state than they found it. and I can relate to that. You know, I want to be kind to my future self, but also my, you know, the next generation of people who come along. And they're just, I think they're smart, they care about people deeply. And that's something that I really admire about Westpac. You know, compared to some of the startups and scale-ups I've worked at before, you know, if there's an incident, that they send food out to you.
Yeah.
You know, if you've been on a call for just a number of hours, they're like, are you okay? Do you need something? Can I send you a coffee? Can I send you some food? And my manager was always the first to suggest that, not just to me, but anybody. Yeah. He's just a really caring person. So
yeah, empathetic on call is a difficult management challenge, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
Very important.
We are almost at time, and we have not talked about your PriorityZero yet. So I'm going to ask you, this podcast is called PriorityZero. We like to know, what is that one thing that is the top of your list and you're most concerned about at the moment?
So for me, in the last couple of years with, ChatGPT comes out, and I mean, I've had a side interest in AI for a long time, but it just wasn't going anywhere until ChatGPT came along, and suddenly
then it went everywhere all at once.
All at once, right? And it's really caught everybody by surprise. And then GitHub Copilot, and I'm starting to see how it's going to change, it has the potential to change how we build software, and in particular, the role of the software engineer. I can't help but feel that it's going to change quite significantly over the next few years. Yeah.
You talked earlier about that experience of building BASIC and the frustration of it. And if you got something wrong, you had to loop all the way back to the beginning. And yeah, that's annoying. But is it annoying in a good way that we are now losing with these tools that kind of abstract away some of that frustration that might actually be valuable?
That's what I'm excited, and I'm a little worried, right? Because you learn through experience.
Yeah.
You learn through banging your head against that screen endlessly until you get it to work. And now if all you have to do is ask an AI to do it for you, are you going to learn? Are you going to retain that knowledge? But maybe it doesn't matter. So that's the side of it that I'm really interested in. So
one of my favorite quotes about engineering was always that engineers always like to build more and more complex mousetraps. But at the end of the day, if you don't get stung by it every now and then, you're probably not going to learn.
That's right, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I can't help but feel that there will definitely still be roles for software engineers, but how we code and how we build solutions will change. And I think that perhaps we'll spend less time writing code and maybe more time reviewing code, testing code. And we might become really good at prompt engineering. Maybe that's the programming language of the future. You know, just make sure that you are explicit enough with the context that you give it so that it does what you need it to do. I'm so interested in this that I've now started a part-time master's as well as my full-time job, because, you know, I like to challenge myself. It's a lot, to be honest, and prepping for a talk like this as well, everything at once. But it's just so interesting, and you know, it's happening so fast though that I think doing a part-time master's takes 2 years. So by the time I finish, it may be completely different to what it's like right now.
Could be.
So I don't know. We'll see.
So what are the areas that you're kind of most interested in digging into? I think you're although it's a lot, you are in a privileged position with your role to be able to kind of spend time thinking about what impact this might have. What areas are you most interested in?
I'm really looking more at the perceptions of software engineers. So I've got sort of 4 research questions ranging from will engineers spend more or less time on different activities? So just like what we touched on before, perhaps spend less time writing code and more time reviewing it or testing it. I'm really interested to understand whether engineers it will change the way that we acquire skills and retain skills. So what impact will that have on education? You know, because we've got to prep the next generation as well. There's no point teaching them something that's not going to be useful.
And academia does not move fast.
That's right. So, you know, what can we do to encourage a transition to whatever the new skill will be? And I'm particularly interested to see if prompt engineering does take off. You know, when that first cottoned on as a name, I wasn't really sure. It's a bit, that sounds a bit funny, but there's probably something there. You know, it might end up being given a slightly different name, but being good at using the tool, I suspect that will become quite important. And, you know, when I started coding, we didn't even have Visual Studio, so I became good at using that, so I can't see why now maybe the next thing that you have to become good at using are these tools.
Yeah, I had similar skepticism, and then I started seeing people being paid $150,000 to be a prompt engineer. I became even more skeptical. But then I dug into what it really means, and it would be a whole other podcast. But it is definitely it's definitely a new skill and definitely a really interesting area that's well worth digging into.
Absolutely. So. Well, I hope to find out enough that I can publish some papers on it or something and help, the next generation get that leg up.
And we'll get you back on and talk about it again.
Yes, I'd love that.
All right, we always like to finish on a recommendation. So is there anything you've read, seen, listened to recently that you want to recommend?
Yes, absolutely. So it's a book. It's called Wiring the Winning Organization.
Oh yeah, Gene Kim.
That's right, Gene Kim and Stephen Spear.
Yeah.
Just such a great book. I mean, you start off with the Phoenix Project and then the Unicorn Project and now this one. Like, Gene Kim just has an amazing amount of things to say, and he just says it in such a way that it resonates. It's so hard. You're like, have you been at the places that I've worked at and just observed and written a book about it, because it feels so real. And this book just kind of summarizes so much great content into really digestible chunks. It talks about, slowification, a word that he admits he kind of made up, but it makes sense. Simplification and amplification. And immediately you start to see how important things like amplification, like just to give it a name. But, there's so much that happens in your day-to-day that you're like, oh yeah, the build just takes a little longer, but we deal with it. Oh, sometimes it just fails and we just replay it and that's fine. But should it be fine, Actually, we need to amplify those problems, and to see it written down, you're like, yes, that makes sense. I've just walked around telling people, you should read the book, because here it talks about this, and I think we need to do more of that. So absolutely, that book is worth gold.
Great recommendation, thank you.
You're welcome.
Right, Annie, it was a real pleasure talking to you, hearing about your kind of winding journey through tech. I wish you all the best with your research. I can't wait to hear more about it. And thanks again, and see you soon.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's been great to be here.
Thank you again for listening to PriorityZero, a LeadDev podcast. Remember, you can get us wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify. But when you do, please remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And we hope to see you at the next one.